I flew 18 hours across the Pacific Ocean just to watch my own mother lock the doors of my sister's wedding venue right in my face. "You do not belong here," she told me, her voice dripping with disgust. Her exact words were that I did not fit the aesthetic of her new son-in-law's old money family. So I turned around and walked away. 3 days later, that same mother called my private line in a total panic. The wedding bill was $40,000 past due, and they were about to be arrested for fraud. She begged for my money. I simply laughed into the receiver. "You made it very clear I wasn't family," I reminded her. Then I hung up, and their absolute nightmare began. Before I tell you how I dismantled their fake lives piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind your toxic family exactly who holds the power. The black town car crunched over the pristine white gravel of the sprawling Napa Valley Vineyard estate. I leaned my head back against the cool leather seat and took a deep, steadying breath. I was absolutely exhausted. I had just closed a brutal acquisition deal in Tokyo, flying 18 hours straight, navigating time zones and sleep deprivation, just to make it to this venue on time. I did not even stop at my hotel to rest. I went straight from the private tarmac to the vineyard, because today was my younger sister Chloe's wedding day. Despite our fractured history, despite the fact that my family had practically discarded me when I was a teenager, I decided to be the bigger person. I was 33 years old now, the founder and chief executive officer of a top-tier luxury debt acquisition and crisis management firm in Los Angeles. I had built an empire from the ground up. I did not need their validation anymore, but I still carried a sliver of hope that showing up with grace would mend the broken bridges between us. I stepped out of the heavy vehicle into the crisp California air. I felt powerful. I was wearing a flawlessly tailored emerald green silk suit that moved like liquid when I walked. My natural crown of locks was styled perfectly, a regal halo that I wore with immense pride. Tucked securely inside my designer handbag was a pristine white envelope containing a cashier's check for $10,000. It was my wedding gift to Chloe, a quiet olive branch, a peace offering to show that I harbored no ill will toward her new life. I adjusted my jacket, thanked my driver, and began the long walk up the manicured stone pathway toward the grand mahogany doors of the main estate. The estate was breathtaking, radiating an aura of excessive wealth. Lush green vines stretched out for miles under the golden afternoon sun. I could hear the faint, elegant melodies of a live string quartet drifting from the courtyard where the ceremony was set to take place. Waiters in crisp white uniforms were carrying trays of expensive champagne. It was a picture-perfect scene, exactly the kind of high society event my mother, Rochelle, had spent her entire life obsessing over. Rochelle lived for the country club image. She breathed for the approval of wealthy neighbors and socialites. As I approached the massive wooden doors, I felt a flutter of genuine anticipation. I reached out to grasp the heavy brass handle, but before my fingers could make contact, the door was pulled open from the inside. I smiled, ready to greet whoever stood there, but the smile died on my lips almost instantly. Blocking the entrance, standing shoulder to shoulder like palace guards, were my mother Rochelle and my sister Chloe. Chloe looked stunning in a custom beaded white gown, but her face was twisted into a familiar sneer of superiority. Rochelle stood beside her, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning me from the top of my locks down to my designer heels. There was no warmth in her gaze, no relief that her eldest daughter had made it safely across the globe to attend this milestone. There was only a visceral, unfiltered disgust. I stopped on the top step, the heavy mahogany doors forming a physical barrier between my world and theirs. "Hello, Mom," I said, keeping my voice steady and pleasant despite the sudden drop in temperature. "You look beautiful, Chloe. Congratulations." I came straight from the airport. Neither of them moved an inch to let me inside. Rochelle crossed her arms over her chest, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her silk wrap. "You cannot come in here looking like this," Rochelle hissed. Her voice was a venomous whisper deliberately kept low so the mingling guests inside the foyer would not hear the commotion. I looked down at my impeccable emerald suit, momentarily confused, looking like what I am wearing a formal suit. Rochelle let out a sharp, condescending breath. You know exactly what I mean, Zora. Preston's family is conservative. They are old money from Connecticut. They are respectable people with certain expectations. Your loud vibe, your aggressive, independent attitude, and that hair, it simply does not fit the aesthetic we are presenting today. I stood frozen, the words hitting me like physical strikes. She was looking right at me, a highly successful, self-made African-American woman, and calling my very existence an aesthetic problem. She was prioritizing the comfort of her future white son-in-law's family over her own flesh and blood. This is a private family-only event. Rochelle continued, her eyes narrowing with cold calculation. And right now, frankly, you are an embarrassment to the image we have worked so hard to cultivate. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air between us. An embarrassment. I was the only person standing on that porch who held any real wealth, the only one who had built a legitimate legacy. Yet she looked at me like I was something she scraped off the bottom of her shoe. I felt the familiar bitter sting of rejection rise in my chest, the exact same feeling I had when my father Desmond kicked me out with a garbage bag full of clothes years ago. Chloe let out a dramatic sigh, adjusting the diamond necklace resting on her collarbone. Just go, Zora, Chloe said, rolling her eyes as if my presence was exhausting her. Dad said you would only come here to ruin my perfect day because you are bitter. You couldn't secure a wealthy man yourself, so you just want to drag me down. Preston's parents are inside right now, and they do not need to meet the family outcast. I looked at my sister, taking in the vanity and the sheer delusion radiating from her. She was 29 years old, completely dependent on our parents' fabricated wealth, yet she spoke to me with an arrogance that only unearned privilege could produce. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. The exhaustion from my 18-hour flight vanished, replaced by a cold, hyper-focused clarity. Are you absolutely certain about this, Rochelle? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. I flew across the world to bring my sister a wedding gift and celebrate her marriage. You are choosing to leave me on the doorstep. We made our choice. Rochelle snapped, her jaw tight. You do not belong here. Go back to Los Angeles and play businesswoman. Today is about real success and real family. I held my ground, my hand instinctively tightening around the strap of my bag where the $10,000 check rested. I was about to turn around and walk away with my dignity fully intact. I was about to let them have their fake, superficial fantasy. But before I could pivot on my heel, a shadow moved in the grand foyer behind them. The heavy mahogany doors were pulled open a few inches wider. Preston the groom stepped out of the shadows and into the California sunlight, a deeply arrogant, smug grin plastered across his pale face. I flew 18 hours across the Pacific Ocean just to hand my sister a $10,000 wedding gift, only for my own mother to lock the doors of the venue right in my face. You do not fit the old money aesthetic, she sneered, discarding me like absolute trash on the front porch. So I looked. The arrogant groom dead in the eye, tore the check into pieces, dropped the scraps onto his polished Italian leather shoes, and walked away. I did not shed a single tear. I just picked up my phone and legally bought the debt to their entire fake life. 3 days later, they were facing jail time and begging for the very money they had just rejected. Here is exactly how I dismantled my toxic family and legally repossessed their lives. Preston stepped fully into the harsh California sunlight, bringing with him an overwhelming aura of unearned entitlement. He adjusted the cuffs of a tuxedo that was trying far too hard to project generational wealth, his movements deliberately slow and condescending. He wrapped a heavy, possessive arm around my sister's waist, pulling Chloe against his side in a gesture that felt less like genuine affection and more like a man claiming a shiny new accessory. His eyes, a pale and watery blue, washed over me with a level of disdain that actually made my skin prickle. He did not see a highly successful woman standing before him. He saw an insect that had somehow crawled onto his pristine rented property. Without breaking his condescending stare, Preston lifted his free hand and barely flicked his wrist, signaling to the two massive private security guards who were flanking the courtyard entrance. The guards, dressed in ill-fitting black suits with earpieces spiraling down their necks, immediately stiffened and began heavy-stepping their way toward the porch. "We do not need your little freelance hustle energy ruining a six-figure event," Preston sneered. His voice was a practiced, lazy drawl, the exact kind of tone perfected in Ivy League fraternity houses by boys who had never worked a hard day in their entire lives. "Security will escort you to the curb." He looked right past me, his gaze fixing on the distant rolling hills of the vineyard, entirely dismissing me as a threat. Freelance hustle energy. The sheer breathtaking irony of his insult almost pulled a genuine laugh from my throat. I stood there, the sole owner and chief executive officer of a firm that acquired and liquidated commercial debt on a global scale. I routinely dismantled and restructured companies worth 10 times the value of this rented vineyard. Yet here was Preston, a man whose entire personality was built on a trust fund myth, reducing my 15 years of grueling, relentless corporate ascension to a petty side hustle. I kept my face an impenetrable mask of absolute calm, locking my eyes onto his. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to feel the heavy weight of my unblinking stare. I dealt with corporate sharks for a living. Preston was barely a minnow. Then Chloe chimed in, her voice shrill and trembling with her trademark manufactured victimhood. "Just go away, Zora," she whined, clutching the lapels of Preston's tuxedo as if I were about to physically attack her. "Dad said you would only come here to ruin my perfect day because you are bitter. You could not secure a wealthy man yourself, so you just want to drag me down with your miserable energy." There it was, the toxic ghost of our father Desmond speaking directly through her glossy lips. I did not need to see Desmond in the flesh to know exactly what he had been saying behind my back. My father had always measured a woman's entire value by the bank account of the man standing beside her. He believed a woman was nothing without a man's name to legitimize her. My mind flashed back to the night my family shattered for good. I was 18 years old, working double shifts at a diner and a retail store to save every penny for my college tuition. I had managed to scrape together $5,000. Desmond had walked into my room, demanded I hand over my bank information, and told me the family needed my savings to pay for Chloe's regional beauty pageant fees. When I looked him in the eye and refused, he did not hesitate. He threw a garbage bag of my clothes onto the rain-slicked driveway, locked the front door, and told me I would fail in the real world because I was too stubborn to know my proper place. I had spent the next 15 years proving him wrong. I built a mountain of wealth that required no man's signature, no husband's permission, and no father's approval. Chloe, meanwhile, had learned the exact lesson Desmond taught her perfectly. She had secured a man, or at least the illusion of one, trading her independence for a fake diamond ring and a rented vineyard backdrop. I looked at my mother, Rochelle, whose eyes were darting nervously between me and the approaching security guards. She wanted me gone before the rest of the wealthy guests noticed the tension brewing on the steps. She was absolutely terrified that my presence, the presence of the daughter she had thrown away, would shatter her carefully constructed illusion of aristocratic perfection. The security guards reached the bottom of the steps, their hands hovering near their radios. "Ma'am, we are going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately," the taller one grunted, trying to sound intimidating. But he hesitated. He looked at my tailored emerald silk suit, the flawless posture I held, the absolute lack of fear radiating from my stance. People who are used to being thrown out of places usually panic or raise their voices. I simply stood my ground, immovable and serene. My silence was unnerving them. I did not cry. I did not beg for an invitation to a dinner table that had been intentionally set without a chair for me. I did not raise my voice to defend my success or explain the millions sitting securely in my corporate accounts. Explaining your power to people who are utterly committed to misunderstanding you is a complete waste of breath. I had come here to offer grace, and they had spit on it. So I decided to give them exactly what they asked for. I calmly reached into my dark leather handbag. It was an exclusive custom piece that Rochelle would have recognized immediately if she were half the high society expert she pretended to be. My fingers brushed against the crisp edge of the thick white envelope I had tucked inside that morning. I pulled it out slowly, deliberately, ensuring that all three of them were watching my hands. I slipped my manicured fingernail under the seal and opened the flap. From inside the envelope, I withdrew a bank-certified cashier's check. It was printed on heavy, watermarked paper, the kind that cannot be faked or bounced. I held it up between my index and middle finger, letting it catch the bright afternoon sunlight. I positioned it perfectly so that Preston, with his arrogant sneer, and Rochelle, with her wide, calculating eyes, had a clear, unobstructed view of the bold black numbers printed across the center line. $10,000. It was a staggering amount for a wedding gift. It was an amount that would have covered a massive chunk of their exorbitant catering budget. I watched the realization hit them in real time like a physical blow to the chest. The smug sneer on Preston's face faltered instantly, slipping into a look of sudden, hungry confusion. Rochelle's eyes locked onto the zeros, her breath catching audibly in her throat. Even Chloe stopped her incessant whining, her gaze dropping magnetically to the heavy paper in my hand. In their minds, I was a struggling outcast. I was a bitter failure who could not afford to be in their presence. The sight of that much liquid cash offered freely as a gift shattered their entire narrative in a fraction of a second. For one split second, the air on the porch was entirely still. They waited. They actually assumed I was going to hand the check over. They believed that despite their insults, despite threatening me with security, and despite calling me a miserable embarrassment, my desperate need for their family loyalty would force me to buy my way into their good graces. They truly believed I would pay them for the privilege of their disrespect, maintaining absolute dead eye contact with Preston. I gripped the top edge of the cashier's check with both hands. I did not blink. I did not look away. I pulled my hands apart, tearing the thick paper perfectly down the middle. The sharp, crisp sound of the tearing check echoed loudly on the quiet porch. Rochelle let out a small, involuntary gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth in shock. Chloe's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. I placed the two torn halves together, gripped them tightly, and tore them again, reducing the $10,000 gift into useless, jagged quarters. I extended my arm directly over Preston's meticulously polished Italian leather shoes. I opened my fingers and let the pieces fall. They fluttered down through the air like the world's most expensive confetti, landing softly against the scuffed tips of his loafers and scattering across the pristine white stone of the porch. Preston looked down at the shredded pieces of money, his face turning a blotchy, uneven shade of red. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The sheer shock of watching that much money destroyed right in front of him had temporarily short-circuited his arrogant brain. I looked up, meeting Chloe's horrified stare, and then shifted my gaze to my mother's pale, stunned face. The satisfaction bubbling in my chest was absolute and pure. They had wanted to make me feel small and insignificant, but all they had done was remind me exactly how powerful I had become without them. "Have a beautiful wedding," I said. My voice was smooth, melodic, and entirely empty of emotion. I did not wait for a response. I did not look back to see if the security guards were still hovering nearby. I simply pivoted sharply on the heel of my emerald stilettos and began my descent down the grand stone pathway. My head was held high, my shoulders thrown back, the tailored lines of my suit cutting a sharp, confident silhouette against the sprawling vineyard. Behind me, the heavy silence of the porch was broken only by the faint rustle of the torn check blowing gently across the stone. I walked away from the family that had tried to break me, entirely unaware that in just 3 days they would be crawling back, begging for the very woman they had just discarded. The crunch of white gravel beneath my emerald stilettos was the only sound accompanying my descent from the grand porch. I kept my spine ruler straight, my shoulders thrown back, and my chin leveled perfectly parallel to the ground. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a backward glance. I knew Rochelle and Chloe were still standing up there, likely clutching each other in mock horror, while Preston stared dumbly at the shredded pieces of a $10,000 check dusting his expensive shoes. I let the warm California sun wash over my face as I walked toward the idling black SUV waiting for me at the edge of the circular driveway. The valet rushed forward, his eyes wide, hurriedly pulling open the heavy door of the luxury vehicle. I stepped up and slid into the deep plush leather seats of the spacious back cabin. The valet firmly shut the door behind me, and the heavy thud instantly cut off the faint, elegant melodies of the string quartet still playing in the courtyard. The sudden silence inside the climate-controlled vehicle felt absolute and heavy, like a physical boundary, dropping permanently between my past and my present. My driver caught my eye in the rearview mirror. His professional demeanor masked the obvious question, but I simply gave him a short, definitive nod. We pulled away from the pristine estate, the tires gliding smoothly over the asphalt as we wound our way down the private road, leaving the sprawling vineyard behind us. I settled deep into the leather, letting my head rest against the headrest. The silence in the car was incredibly thick, pressing against my eardrums, but my mind was racing with a terrifyingly cold calculation. A younger version of me, the 18-year-old girl who had been tossed out onto the street, like discarded trash with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes, would have crumbled in this exact moment. She would have wept into her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, wondering why her own mother and sister found her so utterly repulsive. She would have desperately questioned what she could have done differently to earn a seat at their table. But I was not that frightened girl anymore. I was a 33-year-old woman who had built an empire out of nothing. I waited for the familiar sting of tears, for the knot of grief to rise in my throat, but nothing came. Not a single tear formed in my eyes. I felt no sorrow, no heartbreak, no desperate longing for their approval. Instead, a profound icy calm washed over every nerve in my body. I had flown across the Pacific Ocean to offer them a chance at peace, and they had chosen absolute war. My phone, resting silently on the center console, buzzed with the sharp, sudden vibration of an incoming text message. The bright screen illuminated the dim-tinted interior of the back seat. I picked it up and stared at the sender identification. It read, Desmond, my father. My lips curled into a humorless, bitter smile. Of course it was him, the man who had not possessed the basic courage to stand on that porch and face me himself. He preferred to let his vain wife and his golden child do his dirty work, while he cowered safely inside, rubbing elbows with his new supposedly old money-in-laws. He was terrified that my presence would somehow strip away his carefully manufactured facade of wealth. I unlocked the screen, vaguely wondering if he was demanding that I return to apologize to his precious groom. The message was brutally brief, consisting of only 2 sentences. Do not ever disrespect Preston's family again. You are dead to us. I read the words twice, letting the sheer weight of them settle into my chest. You are dead to us. For 15 years, I had maintained a tiny, foolish, stubborn ember of hope that one day my father would look at the legitimate multi-million-dollar enterprise I had built and feel a shred of actual pride. I had hoped that time and distance would make him realize his mistake, but this text was the final definitive nail in the coffin. He had not changed. He was still the exact same coward who prioritized the illusion of high society wealth over the life of his actual daughter. He cared more about the scuffed leather shoes of a grifting, arrogant groom than the fact that his eldest child had crossed the world to extend a hand of forgiveness. He was telling me I was dead to him. I locked my phone, watching the screen go completely black, reflecting my own calm, unbothered expression. If I was dead to them, then the obedient, forgiving daughter, who owed them any shred of loyalty, was officially buried. The woman sitting in this car was a corporate debt collector, a ruthless crisis manager, and the chief executive officer of an acquisition firm that destroyed companies before breakfast. And it was time to collect on a 15-year-old debt. I turned my head to look out the tinted window as the SUV navigated the winding, picturesque roads of the Napa Valley. The sprawling vineyard estate was magnificent, an architectural marvel of luxury and exclusivity that commanded top-tier prices. But in my specific line of work, I knew exactly how places like this operated. High-end venues catering to the elite were almost always leveraged to the absolute brim. They relied on continuous, massive cash flow and heavy lines of corporate credit just to keep the crystal chandeliers shining and the vintage champagne flowing. Preston and Chloe had booked this deeply expensive property to project an image of untouchable elite wealth to their guests. I was going to show them what untouchable power actually looked like. I reached forward and firmly tapped the speed dial on the central console display of the vehicle. The Bluetooth speakerphone engaged ringing only once before a sharp, wide-awake voice answered the line. It was Malik, my lead investigator, my right-hand man, and the most relentlessly efficient corporate predator I had ever personally trained. He was back in our Los Angeles penthouse offices, but I knew he would be at his massive desk monitoring the global markets and waiting for my check-in. "Talk to me, Boss Malik," said his voice crisp and clear through the luxury car speakers. "Malik," I replied, my tone entirely void of emotion, entirely stripped of the sister who had just been turned away. "I need you to pull up the ownership structure for the luxury vineyard estate. I am currently leaving in Napa." "Give me 5 seconds," he said. I could hear the rapid rhythmic clacking of his mechanical keyboard in the background as he immediately dove into our firm's proprietary databases. "Got it. It operates under a nested LLC structure. Heavy commercial mortgages on the primary land. Looks like they have a couple of mezzanine loans floating around to cover recent renovations, plus extensive vendor credit lines for their events division. Perfect," I said, a slow, dangerous smile, finally touching the corners of my mouth. "Find out exactly who holds their commercial debt, their default lines, and their catering vendor accounts. I want to know every bank, every private lender, and every shadow creditor keeping that specific property afloat." "Consider it done," Malik replied without a single moment of hesitation. "What is the play here? We usually don't target hospitality venues unless we are liquidating." I looked out the window one last time as the grand iron gates of the estate disappeared behind the rolling green hills. "Buy it," I commanded softly, my voice carrying the lethal weight of a finalized execution order. "Buy all of it. Offer a premium over market value if you have to clear the red tape and bypass the standard acquisition protocols. I want our firm holding every single cent of that vineyard's debt by Monday morning." 3 days later, the morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Los Angeles penthouse office, casting long, sharp shadows across my polished glass desk. I stood looking out over the sprawling city skyline, a mug of black coffee warming my hand. Down there, millions of people were rushing to start their work week, completely oblivious to the quiet, devastating power plays happening high above them. I turned my attention back to the massive red leather-bound dossier resting in the center of my desk. Malik had outdone himself. True to my directive, my firm had spent the weekend moving aggressively through shadow networks and private lending channels. By 9 o'clock this Monday morning, we had successfully acquired every single ounce of commercial debt default line and vendor credit associated with that hyper-exclusive Napa Valley vineyard. I slowly flipped open the heavy cover of the dossier, running my manicured index finger down the long, detailed list of outstanding accounts. The numbers painted a picture of absolute financial recklessness. It was beautiful. I now legally owned the ground they had stood on to insult me. I owned the catering contracts. I owned the property damage liens. I was no longer just the discarded daughter. I was the master creditor of their entire wedding venue. The sharp, demanding ring of my private cell phone shattered the quiet hum of my office. I glanced down at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed a name I had not seen light up my personal device in over a decade. Rochelle, my mother. For a brief, irrational second, a phantom echo of the obedient, desperate-to-please 18-year-old girl flickered in my chest. I felt a tight knot form in my stomach, the conditioned response to a woman whose only use for me had always been deeply transactional. I remembered begging her for just $50 to keep my electricity turned on during my first year in Los Angeles, only for her to hang up the phone because she was late for a country club tennis match. But the woman standing in this office was not that starving, desperate girl anymore. I picked up the sleek device, swiped the screen to answer, and pressed it to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply breathed, waiting for her to speak first. Zora, thank God you answered. Rochelle gasped. Her voice was utterly unrecognizable. Gone was the polished aristocratic drawl she used to command her suburban luncheons. Gone was the icy condescending tone she had weaponized against me on the vineyard porch just 72 hours prior. Instead, she sounded breathless, erratic, and teetering on the absolute edge of a complete nervous breakdown. I could hear the chaotic, muffled sounds of a frantic environment in the background. Someone, it sounded exactly like Chloe, was sobbing hysterically, her voice pitching into a high wail. A man was shouting unintelligibly in the distance, his voice echoing off marble walls. "There is an emergency!" Rochelle continued, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate, unhinged rush. A massive emergency. We are still at the hotel in Napa and we cannot leave. The vineyard manager is downstairs in the lobby with the local police. They are threatening to arrest Desmond and Preston for grand larceny and fraud. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, crossing my legs and taking a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I let the silence stretch over the cellular connection, forcing her to stew in her own rising panic. I wanted to hear every single miserable detail of their unraveling facade. "They are claiming we owe them $40,000. Rochelle cried out, her voice cracking with indignation and fear. It is an absolute outrage. There were some minor damages to the property during the reception, a broken antique vase, some stained imported rugs, and the catering company is claiming their final invoice was never processed. It is $40,000, Zora. The manager has locked down our rental vehicles and is refusing to let us leave the premises until the balance is paid in full." "And where is the blushing groom's vast fortune?" I asked. My voice was a calm, cool river cutting straight through her blazing forest fire of anxiety. "I distinctly remember you telling me he came from old money. Surely $40,000 is petty cash for a Connecticut blue blood." Rochelle let out a frustrated, shaky breath. There was a banking error, she insisted, though her voice wavered with the unmistakable tremor of a liar who knows she is backed into a corner. "Preston's family accounts are temporarily frozen. His trust manager is out of the country and cannot authorize the release of funds until tomorrow. It is just a massive, horrible misunderstanding with the international wire transfers. And Desmond." I pushed my eyes, scanning the very debt portfolios on my desk that proved my father was entirely ruined. The great real estate mogul cannot cover his own daughter's wedding damages. "Your father's liquidity is completely tied up in a major commercial acquisition this quarter." Rochelle snapped, a brief flash of her old defensive arrogance surfacing before the sheer panic drowned it out again. "He cannot liquidate those assets without taking a catastrophic penalty. We are backed into a corner, Zora. The police are literally standing by the front desk. If this gets out to the press, if our friends back home hear that Chloe's wedding ended in an arrest over unpaid catering bills, our reputation will be completely annihilated. We will be the laughingstock of our entire social circle." I listened to her prioritize her fragile social standing over the very real threat of criminal charges. She was not crying because she had done something morally wrong or because she had stolen services. She was crying because she was about to be caught and exposed to the wealthy neighbors she desperately wanted to impress. "I need you to wire the money right now," Rochelle demanded. The desperation in her tone quickly morphed into a profound, sickening entitlement. "You have millions sitting in your corporate accounts. I see your name in the business journals. I know you can afford this without even blinking. You need to call your bank and authorize an immediate expedited wire transfer for $40,000 to the Vineyard's holding account." I slowly traced the gold lettering of my name on my desk placard. She had spent 15 years acting like I was a ghost, intentionally ignoring my grueling rise to power, ignoring the years I spent eating ramen noodles and working out of a damp basement to build my company. Yet the exact moment she faced the consequences of her own fraudulent lifestyle, she felt entirely entitled to the fruits of my labor. She was openly demanding the very freelance hustle energy she had mocked to my face just 3 days ago. "Zora, please," Rochelle begged, her voice dropping into a manipulative, trembling plea. "We are your family. We are blood. You cannot just leave us here to be humiliated and arrested by strangers. You are my daughter, and Chloe is your sister. You have to step up and save this family. You owe us that much to protect the family name from public disgrace. If you have any shred of loyalty left in your heart, you will send the money right this second." I let the heavy, desperate silence hang over the secure cellular connection. I leaned back into the soft grain of my ergonomic leather chair, swiveling slightly to face the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling Los Angeles skyline. Down there, millions of people were hustling to survive the brutal daily grind. Up here in the soundproof sanctuary of my penthouse office, I held the fate of my abusers in the palm of my hand. Through the speaker of my private phone, I could hear the absolute chaos unraveling in that Napa Valley hotel lobby. I could hear the panicked, high-pitched shrieks of my sister Chloe in the background, her voice vibrating with a pitch that only sheer terror could produce. I could hear Preston, the supposedly wealthy groom, shouting empty, legally baseless threats at a hotel manager who clearly did not care about his fabricated pedigree. And right in my ear, I could hear the ragged, shallow breathing of my mother, a woman who was finally realizing that her actions had severe, inescapable consequences. She waited for me to capitulate. Rochelle fully expected me to let out an exhausted sigh, open my secure banking application, and blindly wire $40,000 to save their fraudulent reputation. She had conditioned me for years to be the family ATM, the reliable scapegoat who would silently pay the bills while they took the public credit. In her mind, the social humiliation of being arrested in a luxury lobby was a fate worse than death, and it was my absolute duty as her offspring to prevent it. But that version of Zora died on the steps of that vineyard 3 days ago. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, the porcelain cup clinking softly against the glass surface of my desk. The taste was bitter and grounding. "I am sorry, Rochelle," I said. My voice dropped an octave, dripping with absolute glacial ice. "You must have the wrong number." "Zora, stop playing these ridiculous games." Rochelle gasped, her breath hitching as the hotel manager shouted something indistinguishable in the background. "This is not the time to hold a petty grudge. The police are literal steps away from arresting your father and your new brother-in-law. The caterers are threatening to press felony charges for theft of services." 3 days ago, I continued cutting through her rising panic with surgical precision. "Standing on that sunlit porch, you explicitly told me I was not family. You looked at me, your eldest daughter, and told me I was an embarrassment to your cultivated image. You told me my presence would ruin the aesthetic of your new in-laws." "But Zora!" "We were just stressed out," she stammered, frantically attempting to rewrite history the exact way she always did. "Weddings are incredibly high-pressure environments. People say things they do not mean." I did not let her finish the pathetic excuse. "You made your choice, Rochelle. You chose the fake diamonds and the rented vineyard. You chose the man who looked at my 15 years of corporate ascension and called it a freelance hustle. You slammed the door in my face to protect his fragile ego. So I highly suggest you turn around and ask that old money groom to liquidate his precious trust fund. Surely a man of his immense generational wealth has $40,000 in petty cash lying around to cover his own wedding damages." There was a heavy, suffocating pause on the line. The reality of my refusal was finally piercing through her thick layers of entitlement. The realization that no wire transfer was coming, that no rescue was imminent, shattered the fragile, polished mask she wore for the world. When she spoke again, the desperation had fractured, revealing the ugly, venomous core beneath. Her voice morphed from a pleading mother into a cornered, vicious animal. "You ungrateful, miserable wretch!" Rochelle screamed into the receiver, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated rage. The country club facade evaporated completely. "This is exactly why nobody wants you around. You are a bitter, lonely spinster who cannot stand to see her own sister happy. You have all that money, and you are still absolutely nothing. Desmond was right about you from the very beginning. You are a cold, unnatural woman, and you will die alone in that glass tower. I curse the day I gave birth to you." She was winding up for another barrage of toxic, rehearsed insults, drawing in a massive breath to hurl every carefully crafted insecurity she had planted in me since childhood. She wanted to drag me down into the mud with her to make me feel as small and trapped as she currently felt. But I did not give her the satisfaction of an audience. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my choices. I simply reached out and pressed the red icon on my digital display, severing the connection mid-sentence. The line went instantly dead, cutting off her toxic venom with a sharp electronic click. The sudden quiet in my office was profound and deeply comforting. I placed the phone face down on my desk and let out a long, slow breath. My pulse was entirely steady. My hands were not shaking. For the first time in my 33 years of existence, I felt no lingering guilt regarding my family. They had demanded blind loyalty while offering nothing but disdain. They had worshipped the illusion of power while actively mocking the woman who actually wielded it. By cutting them off, I was not being cruel or vindictive. I was executing a perfectly balanced ledger. I had paid my final debt to them by simply walking away and leaving them to the consequences of their own fraudulent choices. The heavy, solid oak door of my office clicked open, breaking the silence of the room. Malik strode into the space. He was wearing a charcoal suit tailored to absolute perfection, his tie perfectly straight, his expression a mask of ruthless efficiency. Malik was not just an employee, he was a financial predator who thrived on tearing down corrupt corporate structures, and I had personally trained him to be the best in the industry. He moved with the silent, purposeful grace of a shark smelling blood in the water. In his right hand, he carried a thick red leather-bound dossier. The color red in our firm indicated a high-priority hostile acquisition. It meant the target had been fully analyzed, the vulnerabilities exploited, and the trap fully sprung. He did not bother knocking, knowing perfectly well that when a red file was active, standard office pleasantries were suspended. Malik bypassed the guest chairs entirely and walked directly to my desk. He did not offer a greeting. He simply lifted his arm and dropped the heavy dossier right onto the center of the glass surface. The satisfying heavy thud echoed off the soundproof walls of the penthouse. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the edge of my desk, a sharp, predatory gleam lighting up his dark eyes. "Boss Malik," said, his voice thrumming with the electric energy of an anticipated victory. "You are going to want to see this." Malik stood perfectly still as the heavy red leather-bound dossier landed on the glass surface of my desk. The sound was a definitive solid thud that resonated through the quiet expanse of my penthouse office. The red file was the ultimate symbol of a completed hostile acquisition within our firm. It meant the target was entirely surrounded, the exits were bolted shut, and the financial oxygen was about to be completely cut off. I looked up from the blank screen of my cell phone, leaving my mother's frantic screaming demands firmly in the past, and met Malik's dark, sharp gaze. I did not need to ask if the initial directive was completed. Malik operated with a terrifying efficiency that never required micromanagement. I reached forward, my fingertips tracing the smooth leather cover of the file. "We hold it all," Malik stated, his voice a low, steady rumble. "We bypassed the standard 30-day escrow protocols by leveraging our Platinum Shadow Capital lines. We paid a 12% premium to the primary commercial lenders to expedite the immediate transfer of the paper. As of exactly 8:42 this morning, our firm is the sole master creditor of the Napa Valley Vineyard estate. The catering vendor accounts the property damage liens, and their primary operating lines of credit have been fully and legally reassigned to us. They owe us the $40,000. And because their accounts were already flagged for chronic late payments by the previous lenders, we have the legal right to demand immediate full liquidation of the debt." I opened the cover of the dossier. The crisp white pages were filled with stark black spreadsheets, asset charts, and heavily redacted banking histories. It was a beautiful, devastating language that I read fluently. "Execute the immediate collection notice," I commanded, my eyes scanning the top sheet. "Instruct the vineyard manager that no vehicles are to leave that property until the balance clears our accounts. But you did not bring me a red file just to confirm what I already knew we would accomplish. What else did you find in there, Malik?" Malik leaned his knuckles against the edge of the glass desk, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He reached out and flipped the first 3 pages of the dossier, revealing a dense background check that our forensics team had clearly run over the weekend. We ran a standard stress test on the groom's financial profile, Malik explained. If we were going to assume the debt of a venue currently occupied by an allegedly prominent old money Connecticut family, we needed to know their exact liquidity status to ensure they could not just casually write a check and brush us off. You told me the groom came from generational wealth. I nodded slowly, my eyes locking onto a brightly colored pie chart that indicated severe financial distress. That is exactly what my mother proudly announced on the front porch. She practically bowed to his Italian leather shoes. Well, your mother is either profoundly stupid or highly gullible, Malik said flatly. Preston does not come from old money. He does not come from any money. He is a serial grifter, Zora. He is a completely hollow shell. I sat forward in my ergonomic chair, suddenly hyper-focused. Show me the numbers. Malik tapped a thick, bolded column on the financial report. The blue blood aesthetic is entirely rented. The Italian sports car he drives is leased under a shell corporate name that is currently 3 months past due. The designer tuxedo he wore to the wedding was rented from an exclusive boutique in Beverly Hills that has a standing collection order out against him. As of this morning, Preston is drowning in exactly $250,000 of deeply toxic, unsecured personal debt. He has maxed out 14 different high-yield credit cards to maintain the illusion of being a wealthy socialite. I let out a soft, breathy sound of pure disbelief. Chloe had based her entire sense of superiority on landing a man of immense wealth. Desmond had mocked my career because he believed Chloe had effortlessly married into the elite upper class. And the entire time, Preston was nothing but a sharply dressed parasite. It gets worse, Malik continued, his tone turning even more clinical. We uncovered 2 active civil lawsuits filed against him in the state of California. One is from an independent angel investor who gave Preston $80,000 to launch a fake tech startup that never actually materialized. The second is from a former landlord suing for $60,000 in unpaid rent on a luxury loft in Santa Monica. Preston is facing severe litigation. He is completely cornered. His bank accounts are not frozen due to a simple banking error, like your mother claimed on the phone. They are frozen because his creditors have officially obtained court-ordered garnishments against him. He has exactly $0 to his name. I stared at the pages, my mind rapidly connecting the dots. A man drowning in $250,000 of toxic debt facing multiple civil lawsuits does not accidentally wander into a high-profile marriage. He targets his prey. He calculates the exact return on investment. Why did he choose Chloe? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My family is obsessed with status, but they are incredibly careful with their associations. How did a grifter manage to bypass Desmond's paranoid financial radar? Malik flipped to the next section of the dossier, revealing copies of private emails and contract drafts that our cyber team had managed to pull from unsecured servers. Because Preston offered your father exactly what your father craves most: the illusion of a prestigious corporate legacy. Preston convinced Desmond that his fake family trust was looking to diversify into West Coast commercial real estate. In exchange for marrying Chloe, Desmond promised Preston a massive controlling partnership in your family's real estate business. I read the highlighted text in the contract draft. Desmond had literally drawn up a managing partner agreement complete with a massive signing bonus and a 6-figure base salary, effectively offering Preston a golden parachute right out of his massive debt. Preston was using my sister as a life raft. He married Chloe exclusively for the guaranteed corporate salary and the immediate access to my father's supposed wealth. It is the perfect con, I murmured, trailing my fingers over the forged documents. Preston brings the fake blue blood prestige to elevate my parents' social standing. Desmond brings the corporate real estate money to erase Preston's massive debt. They both get exactly what they want. They are buying into each other's lies. Malik stood up straight, crossing his arms over his chest. He took a deep breath, and I recognized the specific look in his eyes. It was the look he got right before he delivered the absolute killing blow in a hostile negotiation. He reached across the desk and flipped a heavy stack of papers to the very last page of the dossier. It is the perfect con, Malik corrected softly. Except for one massive foundational problem. He tapped a stark official county property record displayed on the final page. It gets worse, Zora. Much worse. Your dad does not have a real estate business to give him. I froze completely. The air in my office seemed to suddenly thin out. What are you talking about? Desmond has operated that commercial firm for 20 years. He has strip malls. He has office parks. He had strip malls, Malik corrected. He had office parks. We pulled the county deeds and the corporate filings for everything under your father's name. Desmond's real estate empire is entirely gone. It is nothing but a hollow shell corporation functioning on fumes. He liquidated his primary commercial assets 4 years ago to cover a series of catastrophic, highly leveraged development deals that went completely sideways. He has been moving imaginary money around on paper for years just to maintain his country club memberships and lease his luxury cars. I looked down at the property record Malik had tapped. It was the deed to my childhood home, the sprawling manicured estate that Rochelle prided herself on. Look at the lien history, Malik instructed, his voice dropping into a deadly, serious register. To keep up the facade of wealth to pay for Chloe's exorbitant shopping habits and to fund this massive 6-figure fake vineyard wedding, Desmond leveraged the only tangible asset he had left. He secretly took out a third mortgage on their family home. The interest rates are completely predatory. If he misses a single payment, the bank will immediately initiate foreclosure proceedings. Your parents are functionally bankrupt, Zora. The magnitude of the revelation crashed over me like a physical tidal wave. I sat back in my chair, staring blindly at the ceiling as the sheer chaotic poetry of the situation settled into my brain. They are conning each other. I said the words escaping my lips in a breathless, genuine laugh. Preston married Chloe to get access to Desmond's thriving real estate fortune to pay off his massive hidden debt. Desmond promised Preston the partnership because he was desperate to attach the family name to Preston's fake generational wealth, hoping a rich son-in-law would somehow bail him out of his own financial ruin. They are two desperate drowning men who just handcuffed themselves to each other, absolutely convinced the other one knows how to swim. And right in the middle of it all, Malik added, leaning back against the glass wall of the office, is a $40,000 vineyard bill that neither side can actually pay. The groom's accounts are seized by creditors, and the father of the bride cannot pull a single dollar from his accounts without triggering an immediate default on his third mortgage. The house of cards is completely collapsing. I thought back to the horrific scene on the porch just 3 days ago. I thought about Rochelle sneering at my hair and my independence. I thought about Chloe mocking my lack of a wealthy husband. I thought about Preston calling my legitimate corporate empire a freelance hustle. They had stood on their rented stage utterly convinced of their absolute superiority while financially bleeding to death behind the scenes. They had thrown me away because I was the only honest thing in their entire existence. I was the only person standing on that porch who actually possessed the wealth they were all desperately pretending to have. And now, by a twist of absolute fate and my own ruthless business acumen, I was the sole entity holding the sledgehammer over their fragile fake reality. I owned the debt that was about to expose them all. Malik watched me closely, waiting for the final directive. We have the legal right to enforce collection on the vineyard debt immediately. Do we proceed with the asset freeze and alert the local authorities that the balance is in default? I placed both of my hands flat on the glass desk, feeling the cool, solid reality of my own power beneath my palms. The anger that had fueled my early career, the deep burning need to prove my father wrong, completely vanished. It was replaced by something far more dangerous: absolute calculating clarity. I was going to dismantle their illusion piece by agonizing piece. Initiate the collection protocol, I commanded, my voice ringing with finality. Do not accept partial payments. Do not negotiate a payment plan. Inform the vineyard manager that as the primary debt holder, our firm demands full and immediate restitution before anyone is allowed to vacate that property. Let the police handle the rest. Let them all realize exactly who holds the keys to their fake kingdom. I leaned back into the deep, supportive leather of my ergonomic chair, letting her frantic, entitled demand hang in the perfectly climate-controlled air of my penthouse office. The sheer, blinding audacity of her statement was almost magnificent in its delusion. I did not immediately respond. Instead, I allowed the silence to stretch, pulling taut like a wire across the secure cellular connection between us. I wanted her to feel the crushing weight of that silence. I wanted her to stew in the rising, suffocating panic that was currently flooding the lobby of that opulent Napa Valley hotel. Through the high-fidelity speaker of my phone, the chaotic symphony of their ruin played out in real time. I could hear the sharp, echoing clicks of expensive heels pacing frantically across marble floors. I could hear Chloe, my darling picture, perfect younger sister, letting out a series of high-pitched, hyperventilating sobs that sounded more like a dying bird than a blushing bride. In the deeper background, the muffled, authoritative voice of the hotel manager was cutting through the noise, likely demanding immediate payment or threatening to involve local law enforcement. And right in my ear, I could hear Rochelle's ragged, uneven breathing. She was waiting for me to capitulate. She was entirely accustomed to my obedience. For 31 years, she had relied on the foundational belief that no matter how terribly she treated me, no matter how deeply she degraded my existence, the sacred, unbreakable bond of blood would force me to rescue her. She fully expected me to sigh open my secure banking portal and blindly wire $40,000 into the void just to protect the fragile gilded facade of the family name. I slowly rotated my chair, turning my gaze away from the digital glow of my computer screens and toward the sprawling, sunlit expanse of Los Angeles, stretching out beyond my floor-to-ceiling windows. Millions of people were down there navigating the brutal reality of the world, paying their bills and facing their consequences. My family had spent their entire lives floating above that reality on a cloud of borrowed money and fabricated prestige. Today, gravity had finally caught up with them. I picked up my ceramic mug, the dark, rich aroma of black coffee mingling with the faint scent of expensive leather and polished glass in my office. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The liquid was bitter, grounding, and intensely satisfying. I swallowed, feeling the warmth travel down my chest, completely untethered from the hysterical woman weeping on the other end of the line. "Zora!" Rochelle gasped, the silence finally breaking her nerve. "Zora, please tell me you are logging into your accounts. They are threatening to impound Preston's leased vehicles. You have to fix this." I set the coffee mug down. The soft clink of ceramic against glass echoed sharply in my quiet office. I brought the phone closer to my mouth. When I finally spoke, my voice did not rise in anger. It did not tremble with residual childhood trauma. It dropped into a flat, steady register dripping with absolute glacial ice. "I am sorry, Rochelle," I replied, enunciating each syllable with lethal precision. "You must have the wrong number." "What are you talking about?" The confusion in her voice momentarily eclipsed the panic. "Zora, stop playing these ridiculous petty games. This is an absolute emergency. The police are literal steps away from arresting your father." "I am not playing a game, Rochelle. I am simply stating a documented fact." I continued, my tone completely devoid of empathy. "3 days ago, standing on that sun-baked porch of your rented luxury estate, you explicitly told me I was not family." I let the memory of that afternoon wash over me, but it no longer carried the sting of rejection. It was simply a weapon I was now wielding with expert control. "You stood there in your designer gown, surrounded by the expensive floral arrangements I had secretly paid the deposit for, and you told me I was an embarrassment. You told me that my grueling 15-year ascension in the corporate world was nothing but a vulgar freelance hustle. You told me my presence would ruin the curated aesthetic of Chloe's new elite in-laws. You physically blocked the doorway and banished me from the premises because I did not fit into the high society illusion you were desperately trying to sell." "Zora, we were just stressed," Rochelle stammered frantically, attempting to backpedal and rewrite history the exact way she had done my entire life. "Weddings are incredibly high-pressure environments. People say things they do not mean when their nerves are frayed. You know I did not mean it." "You meant every single syllable," I corrected her, my voice slicing through her pathetic excuses like a scalpel. "You made your choice, Rochelle. You chose the fake diamonds and the rented prestige. You chose the man who looked at my empire and sneered. You slammed the door in my face to protect a fragile, superficial ego. So since I am not family, and since I am such a vulgar embarrassment, I highly suggest you turn around and ask that old money groom to liquidate his precious trust fund. I paused, letting a dark, cynical amusement color my words. Surely a man of his immense generational wealth and impeccable Connecticut breeding has $40,000 in petty cash lying around to cover his own wedding damages. Go ask Preston to save you, because the Bank of Zora is permanently closed. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The reality of my refusal was finally piercing through her thick layers of absolute entitlement. The realization that no wire transfer was coming, that no magical rescue was imminent, shattered the fragile, polished mask she wore for the world. When she spoke again, the desperate, pleading mother had completely vanished. The desperation fractured, revealing the ugly, venomous, hateful core beneath. Her voice morphed from a panicked cry into the screech of a cornered, vicious animal. "You ungrateful, miserable wretch!" Rochelle screamed into the phone. The sheer volume of her voice forced me to hold the device an inch away from my ear. The country club facade had evaporated completely, replaced by raw, unadulterated rage. "This is exactly why nobody wants you around. This is why your father cannot stand the sight of you." I listened to her unravel, feeling absolutely nothing. It was like watching a natural disaster from a safe, elevated distance. "You are a bitter, lonely spinster who cannot stand to see her own sister happy," she shrieked, her voice cracking with the strain. She was winding up, hurling every carefully crafted insecurity she had tried to plant in my mind since childhood. I listened to her weaponize my independence. She was a woman who had defined her entire worth by the men she married and the social circles she bought her way into. She could not comprehend a woman who found fulfillment in building an empire rather than securing a ring. When I was eating instant ramen and sleeping under my desk to make payroll for my first 3 employees, my family was attending charity galas they could not afford. Now she was trying to shame me for the very isolation that had guaranteed my immense success. "You think your money makes you superior, but you have all those millions and you are still absolutely nothing," she continued to rage. "You are a cold, unnatural woman, Zora. You will die alone in that glass tower because no man will ever tolerate your miserable, controlling attitude. I curse the day I gave birth to you. You are dead too." I did not let her finish the curse. I did not give her the satisfaction of an audience for her final theatrical breakdown. With a calm, steady hand, I reached out and pressed the red icon on my digital display, severing the connection mid-sentence. The line went instantly dead, cutting off her toxic venom with a sharp electronic click. The sudden quiet in my office was profound, heavy, and deeply comforting. I placed the sleek cellular device face down on the polished glass of my desk and let out a long, slow breath. My pulse was entirely steady. My hands were not shaking. A profound sense of liberation washed over me, settling deep into my bones. For the first time in my 33 years of existence, I felt no lingering guilt regarding my parents. The ledger was finally balanced. The emotional umbilical cord that had tied me to their toxic dysfunction was permanently severed. They had demanded blind loyalty while offering nothing but disdain, and now they were left alone to face the devastating consequences of their own fraudulent choices. I had paid my final debt to them by simply walking away. Before I could fully savor the immense tranquility of the moment, the heavy, solid oak door of my office swung open with a purposeful force. Malik strode into the room. He was wearing a charcoal suit tailored to absolute perfection, his tie perfectly straight, his expression a mask of ruthless, predatory efficiency. Malik was not just my lead financial analyst. He was the tactical executioner of our firm, a man who thrived on tearing down corrupt corporate structures and exposing hidden vulnerabilities. He moved with the silent, purposeful grace of a shark that had just smelled fresh blood in the water. In his large right hand, he held a thick red leather-bound dossier. The color red in our firm's filing system indicated a high-priority hostile acquisition. It meant the target had been fully analyzed, the financial vulnerabilities had been completely exposed, and the trap was ready to be sprung. He did not bother knocking, knowing perfectly well that when a red file was active, standard office pleasantries were entirely suspended. He bypassed the luxurious guest chairs entirely and marched directly to my desk. His dark eyes were alight with a sharp, dangerous intelligence. He lifted his arm and dropped the heavy red dossier right onto the center of the glass surface. The satisfying heavy thud echoed off the soundproof walls of the penthouse. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the edge of the desk, looking down at me with a grim, knowing expression. "Boss," Malik said, his voice thrumming with the electric energy of an impending corporate slaughter. "You're going to want to see this." I spread the thick stack of heavily redacted bank statements and property deeds across the pristine glass surface of my desk. The overhead lights caught the sharp, aggressive angles of my signature on the acquisition orders, a stark contrast to the desperate, trembling signatures Desmond had hastily scribbled on his third mortgage application. Malik stood silently by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his arms crossed over his chest, watching me dissect the financial carcass of my father. I slid a forensic accounting summary toward the center of the desk. The numbers were staggering in their sheer, unfiltered stupidity. Desmond had bled his own company dry. He had siphoned capital from legitimate escrow accounts to pay for country club dues, imported cars, and Rochelle's endless seasonal wardrobe updates. When the corporate accounts ran dry, he had cannibalized the equity in their sprawling suburban estate. He had literally mortgaged the roof over their heads to maintain the absolute illusion of supremacy. "He has not changed," I said, my voice breaking the heavy silence of the penthouse office. I leaned back in my chair, staring at a specific line item detailing a massive cash withdrawal made just days before Chloe's luxury wedding. "He is running the exact same play he ran 15 years ago. He destroys his own foundation to polish the surface, and then he demands that someone else bleed to cover the cost." Malik turned away from the window, his expression a mask of clinical curiosity. "What happened 15 years ago?" he asked. I picked up my gold-plated pen, rolling the cool metal between my fingers as the memories rushed back. They did not arrive with the blinding, suffocating pain they once held. They arrived with the cold, sterile clarity of a solved equation. When I was 18 years old, I told Malik, my eyes fixed on the Los Angeles skyline, I had $18,000 sitting in a basic, low-yield savings account. It was not gifted to me. It was not a trust fund. It was the physical manifestation of 3 years of absolute grueling labor. I worked shifts at a diner that smelled permanently of stale grease. I tutored privileged high school kids in advanced mathematics. I hoarded every single dollar because that money was my exit strategy. It was my full tuition for my first year of university. It was my ticket out of their toxic, suffocating household. Malik remained perfectly still, listening intently. 2 weeks before my tuition was due, I continued. Desmond walked into my bedroom. He did not knock. He never knocked. He stood over me while I was packing my bags and demanded that I transfer my entire savings into his personal checking account. Chloe had been selected to compete in a highly exclusive regional beauty pageant. The entrance fees, the custom gown, the professional hair and makeup team, the private coaching sessions, it all added up to exactly $18,000. Desmond had already maxed out his credit lines, and Rochelle was throwing a hysterical fit about how Chloe absolutely needed this opportunity to secure her social standing. I could see the scene playing out perfectly in my mind. The faded wallpaper of my childhood room. The aggressive, entitled sneer on my father's face. He told me it was an investment in the family brand. I said, my voice hardening at the remembered audacity. He told me that Chloe's success in the pageant circuit would elevate all of us, and that my college education could wait another year. He actually had the nerve to suggest I take out predatory student loans so my younger sister could wear a custom-tailored sequin dress on a rented stage. "What did you do?" Malik asked softly. I told him no. I replied, a sharp, genuine smile touching my lips. I looked my father dead in the eye and refused. I told him my future was not for sale, and I was not going to set myself on fire to keep his favorite daughter warm. The memory of Desmond's explosive reaction was forever burned into my consciousness. The immediate violent shift from manipulative charm to outright hostility. He completely lost his mind. I recounted the words flowing with an icy detachment. He turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. He started screaming that I was a selfish, ungrateful failure. Rochelle rushed into the room crying theatrical tears, accusing me of destroying the family from the inside out. She said I was a bitter, jealous sibling who could not stand to see Chloe shine. They backed me into a corner and told me that if I was not willing to support the family, I had absolutely no right to live under their roof. I set the gold pen down on the glass desk. Desmond did not give me time to process the threat. He dragged a heavy black plastic garbage bag from the kitchen and threw it at my feet. He gave me exactly 10 minutes to empty my closet. I packed my entire life into that thin, tearing plastic. Books, cheap clothes, my laptop. When the 10 minutes were up, Desmond grabbed me by the arm, marched me down the front steps, and shoved me out into the humid summer night. He locked the heavy oak door behind me. I stood on the manicured front lawn, holding a garbage bag, listening to Rochelle comforting Chloe inside, telling her not to worry that they would find the money for the pageant somewhere else. Malik exhaled a long, heavy breath, his jaw clenching. They threw you away for a beauty pageant. They threw me away because I refused to be their sacrificial lamb, I corrected him. I walked 3 miles to a 24-hour diner, dragged my garbage bag into a booth, and ordered a black coffee. I sat there until the sun came up, crying until I thought my chest would crack open. But when morning broke, the tears stopped. I took my $18,000, I paid my tuition, and I never looked back. I gestured toward the sprawling, luxurious office surrounding us, the physical proof of my insurmountable victory. They called me a failure. They told me I would amount to absolutely nothing without their guidance and their name. They had no idea that their cruelty was the exact catalyst I needed. I spent the next decade working with a brutal, relentless obsession. While Desmond was mortgaging his house to buy country club dinners, I was building an empire. While Chloe was chasing wealthy men to fund her lifestyle, I was hostilely acquiring the companies those men worked for. I turned my trauma into a corporate weapon, and I wielded it with absolute perfection. Malik picked up the top page of Desmond's bankruptcy file, a dark amusement returning to his eyes. And now the empire you built owns the debt they used to fund their fake lives. It is almost too poetic, boss. It is basic accounting, I stated, straightening the cuffs of my tailored blazer. You cannot spend your entire life writing fraudulent checks and expect the universe not to eventually collect on the balance. They spent decades conning everyone around them, including themselves. But the numbers never lie. The numbers are completely absolute. Desmond is bankrupt. Preston is bankrupt. And I hold the master key to their utter devastation. I was about to instruct Malik to push the final liquidation orders through our legal department when a sharp, urgent buzzing sound sliced through the quiet of the penthouse. I glanced at the secure communications console mounted on the edge of my desk. A pulsing red light indicated an emergency override from the ground floor security desk. I reached out and pressed the primary intercom button. "Go ahead," I commanded, my voice projecting clearly into the receiver. "Ms. Hayes," the voice of Marcus, my head of security, echoed through the speaker. His tone was tightly controlled, but carrying a distinct edge of urgency. "I apologize for the interruption, but we have a severe situation in the primary lobby." "Report," I said, exchanging a rapid, knowing look with Malik. "4 individuals just breached the outer security perimeter." Marcus explained, the sounds of a muffled, chaotic argument bleeding through his microphone. 2 older adults, 1 younger female, in what appears to be a heavily stained wedding dress, and a younger male in a tuxedo. They completely bypassed the front reception desk and ignored verbal commands to halt. I felt a cold electric thrill race down my spine. The rats had finally figured out they were trapped in a maze, and they had come directly to the exterminator. "Are they contained?" I asked, my voice remaining perfectly level. "My team has intercepted them at the primary elevator bank," Marcus reported. "They are currently causing a massive public disturbance. They are highly agitated, verbally combative, and actively resisting security protocols. The older male is claiming he is your father and demanding immediate access to the penthouse. He states it is a matter of life and death. The younger female is screaming hysterically. Do you want me to authorize physical removal and contact the local authorities for trespassing?" Malik leaned forward, his hands braced on my desk, his eyes locked on mine. He was waiting for the kill order. He was waiting for me to banish them the same way they had banished me. I sat perfectly still, listening to the faint, pathetic echoes of my family's unraveling dignity transmitting through the security feed. Desmond, Rochelle, Chloe, and Preston. The entire fraudulent quartet, standing in the marble lobby of a building I owned, throwing a desperate public tantrum, because the walls of their counterfeit reality had finally caved in. They had come to beg. They had come to demand salvation from the exact woman they had spent a lifetime trying to destroy. I reached out my finger, hovering over the intercom button. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. "Hold your position, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "Do not call the police, and do not remove them from the premises." "Understood, Ms. Hayes," Marcus replied, a hint of confusion in his professional tone. "How would you like us to proceed?" I looked at Malik. The predatory gleam in his eyes matched my own perfectly. The trap was set. The audience was gathered. It was time to pull the lever. "Stand down your perimeter," I commanded, my voice slicing through the intercom like a newly sharpened blade. "Release the security lock on elevator bank A. Send them all the way up to the penthouse. Let them in." The private elevator required a biometric scan to access the penthouse level. Marcus had to manually override the security system from the ground floor desk to grant them entry. The heavy brushed steel doors slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss. Instantly, the quiet, focused hum of my investment firm was violently punctured by the chaotic, shrieking voices of my family. Chloe led the charge. Her highly publicized custom bridal gown was now a wrinkled, disastrous mess. The heavy silk train was stained with dark streaks of what looked like spilled red wine and mud from the vineyard grounds. She was clutching a crumpled tissue, her makeup heavily smeared around her eyes, projecting the ultimate image of a victimized princess. Preston walked close beside her. His rented tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, his tie pulled loose. He was trying to project an air of aristocratic indignation, but I could spot the fine sheen of panicked sweat coating his forehead from 50 feet away. Then came my parents. Rochelle's face was pulled tight with a mixture of sheer terror and absolute fury. She clutched her designer handbag like a shield against the reality of her collapsing social standing. Desmond marched at the front of the pack, his chest puffed out. His face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. He was a man running entirely on the toxic fumes of a dying ego. They stepped off the elevator and onto the imported Italian marble of the reception area. I watched them through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of my office. Desmond stopped for a fraction of a second, his eyes sweeping over the sprawling 70,000-square-foot penthouse. He took in the sleek, minimalist architecture, the rows of high-level financial analysts working quietly behind frosted glass partitions, the panoramic views of the Los Angeles skyline. For a fleeting moment, a shadow of realization crossed his face. But his narcissism was a powerful narcotic. His brain completely refused to compute the idea that the daughter he had discarded like garbage could possibly own a financial fortress of this magnitude. He immediately reconstructed the narrative to protect his fragile pride. He scoffed loudly, his voice booming across the quiet floor. "So this is where you rent your little cubicle space?" Desmond sneered, waving his hand dismissively at the expansive room. "Which one of these desks belongs to you, Zora? I demand to speak to whoever manages this floor." My staff simply stared at him in utter silence. They were highly paid, ruthless financial predators, and they were currently watching a man dig his own grave with a teaspoon. Malik stood perfectly still beside my desk, his arms crossed, a dark, predatory amusement dancing in his eyes. Desmond did not wait for a response from my staff. He spotted me sitting behind my desk in the main corner office. He marched forward, his heavy footsteps echoing aggressively on the hardwood flooring. He did not bother to knock. He simply shoved the heavy glass door open, letting it bang loudly against the magnetic stop, and stormed right into my private sanctuary. Rochelle, Chloe, and Preston flooded in right behind him, bringing the sour, chaotic scent of desperation and stale wine into my perfectly climate-controlled air. Desmond planted himself directly in front of my desk. He slammed both of his hands down flat against the glass surface, leaning his weight forward to loom over me. It was the exact same physical intimidation tactic he used to terrify me when I was a teenager. He wanted to make himself large to cast a shadow over my existence, to force me into submission through sheer physical presence. But I did not shrink back. I did not avert my gaze. I simply looked up at him, my expression entirely blank, watching the veins pulse angrily in his neck. "You are going to pay that $40,000 right now," Desmond bellowed, his voice vibrating with a frantic, unhinged rage. His breath hitched with the sheer effort of maintaining his absolute authority. "And you are going to issue a public apology to Preston's family immediately. Do you hear me? You will not ruin my reputation with your selfish, petty jealousy." Rochelle stepped up right beside him, her hands trembling as she pointed an accusatory finger at my face. "You abandoned your sister on the most important day of her life," she hissed. "You left us to be humiliated in front of the local authorities. You are a disgrace to this family, Zora. You are going to fix this banking error immediately, and you are going to beg for your brother-in-law's forgiveness." I shifted my gaze away from my raging parents and looked directly at the brother-in-law in question. Preston stood just behind Desmond. He had crossed his arms tightly over his chest, puffing his shoulders out in a desperate attempt to look intimidating. He was trying to channel the quiet, dangerous anger of an insulted billionaire. But Preston was not a billionaire. He was a cornered grifter with $250,000 in toxic debt and multiple civil lawsuits waiting to consume him. Unlike Desmond, whose arrogance completely blinded him to reality, Preston was a professional con artist, and con artists have excellent survival instincts. I watched Preston's eyes dart around my office. He took in the scale of the space. He looked at the bespoke furniture, the secure financial terminals, the silent, lethal presence of Malik standing in the corner. Preston's gaze finally dropped to the heavy red leather dossier sitting right in the center of my desk. Preston recognized the color of blood. I saw the exact second his carefully constructed facade cracked. His arrogant scowl faltered. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He uncrossed his arms and took a tiny, almost imperceptible step backward toward the door. Preston suddenly realized that I was not a lowly tenant renting a desk. He realized that he had just walked directly into a slaughterhouse. Desmond slammed his hands against the glass desk a second time, demanding my complete attention. "Did you hear a single word I just said?" he roared, completely oblivious to his new son-in-law's rising terror. "Open your accounts right this second. You are going to wire the funds to the vineyard, and then you are going to call Preston's trust manager and apologize for the delay. You owe this family your complete obedience." Chloe let out another loud, dramatic sob, burying her face into Preston's shoulder. He barely reacted, his eyes still locked in quiet horror on my face. "How could you do this to me?" "Zora," Chloe wailed. "You ruined my perfect day just because you are a miserable, lonely spinster." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer, concentrated toxicity radiating from the four of them. I felt the phantom weight of the plastic garbage bag I had carried out of their house 15 years ago. I remembered the cold night air, the absolute terror of having nothing, and the crushing realization that the people who were supposed to love me had discarded me to fund a beauty pageant. They had called me a failure. They had cast me out into the dark. They had no idea that the darkness was exactly where I learned to hunt. I did not raise my voice to match Desmond's roaring volume. I did not attempt to defend my actions to Rochelle or Chloe. I simply placed both of my hands flat on the arms of my ergonomic chair and pushed myself up. The movement was slow, smooth, and deliberate. The sudden shift in my physical presence forced Desmond to take a slight step back. The frantic energy in the room instantly hit a solid, impenetrable wall of silence. Even Chloe stopped her theatrical sobbing, staring at me with wide, confused eyes. I reached down and calmly buttoned the center button of my tailored charcoal blazer. The simple, sharp movement felt like donning a suit of armor. I looked at the four of them, taking in their wrinkled clothes, their flushed faces, and their profound, pathetic desperation. I raised my right hand and gestured smoothly toward the open door of my office, pointing down the long illuminated hallway toward the massive state-of-the-art glass boardroom at the far end of the penthouse. "If we are going to talk about family business," I said, my voice ringing with a cold, absolute authority that completely filled the room, "let's do it in the boardroom." They stepped off the private elevator and onto the imported Italian marble of the penthouse reception area. I watched them through the expansive glass walls of my office as they began their march across my floor. They moved with a synchronized, arrogant swagger that was completely unearned, their collective body language radiating a toxic mixture of disdain and utter confusion. They were walking through the nerve center of a multi-billion-dollar financial empire surrounded by sleek, minimalist architecture and rows of highly paid, ruthless analysts working quietly behind frosted partitions. Yet their inherent narcissism refused to process the reality of their surroundings. They looked around with sneering expressions, absolutely convinced that I merely rented a small, insignificant cubicle somewhere in the back of this luxury high-rise. Desmond took the lead, his heavy footsteps sinking into the thick, sound-absorbing carpet. He puffed his chest out, attempting to project the authority of a conquering general, inspecting a newly captured territory. He glared at the original contemporary artwork lining the corridor walls, dismissing pieces worth more than his life insurance policy with a single arrogant snort. He was a man running entirely on the fumes of a dying ego, desperate to find someone to punish for his own catastrophic failures. Rochelle marched right beside him, her designer heels clicking sharply wherever the plush carpet gave way to polished stone. She was doing her absolute best to project an air of unimpressed boredom. She ran a highly critical eye over the brushed steel fixtures and the immaculate glass surfaces, visibly searching for a flaw. She wanted to believe this was all a cheap facade. I watched her reach out and drag a finger along the edge of a bronze sculpture near the entrance, checking for dust. Finding none, her jaw tightened in obvious frustration. She was determined to maintain her illusion of superiority, treating my staff like common laborers who were simply in her way. Chloe trailed behind her parents, a miserable walking disaster of ruined silk and smeared cosmetics. The custom bridal gown, which had cost a significant portion of stolen capital to acquire, was now a tattered, heavy rag. Dark, sticky streaks of spilled red wine stained the intricate lace bodice, and the hem was caked with dried mud and crushed grass from the Napa Valley vineyard grounds. She dragged the heavy fabric across the immaculate floor, sniffing loudly and dabbing at her eyes, fully expecting someone to rush forward and offer her a warm towel and a cup of soothing tea. No one did. My staff had been explicitly instructed to ignore them completely. Preston brought up the rear of the procession. He was the only one who seemed to grasp the terrifying gravity of the situation. His arrogant country club posture had completely evaporated. He walked with his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting frantically from the security cameras mounted in the ceiling corners to the broad, imposing figure of Malik, walking silently at my side. Preston recognized true power when he saw it, and he knew instantly that he possessed absolutely none of it. He was a man walking directly to his own execution, too terrified to run and entirely too cowardly to fight. I guided them down the long, illuminated hallway, bypassing my private corner office entirely. I gestured smoothly toward the massive state-of-the-art boardroom at the far end of the corridor. We reached the double doors. The doors were massive slabs of solid, dark mahogany, suspended on frictionless industrial tracks. Malik stepped forward and pushed them open effortlessly, stepping aside to let the fraudulent quartet enter the space. The boardroom was specifically designed to intimidate. It was a sprawling, cavernous room dominated by a 30-foot table carved from a single piece of rare walnut. 20 high-backed, ergonomic black leather chairs lined the perimeter. The far wall was entirely constructed of floor-to-ceiling smart glass, offering an unobstructed, dizzying panoramic view of the sprawling Los Angeles skyline, bathed in the bright afternoon sun. Desmond marched straight in and immediately headed for the chair at the head of the table. It was a predictable, pathetic power play. He wanted to claim the seat of authority, assuming that physical positioning would somehow grant him control over the impending conversation. He dropped his heavy frame into the leather chair, leaning back and resting his hands aggressively on the polished wood. Rochelle took the seat immediately to his right, crossing her legs and lifting her chin in defiance. Chloe slumped into the chair next to her mother, dropping her stained head onto her arms and letting out a long, dramatic groan of absolute misery. Preston hovered near the doorway for a tense, hesitant moment before reluctantly taking a seat at the far end of the table. He was deliberately putting as much physical distance between himself and Desmond as possible, desperate to separate himself from the sinking ship. I did not take a seat. I stood at the opposite end of the mahogany table, remaining on my feet directly facing my father. Malik stepped inside the room and stood perfectly still by the entrance, a silent, immovable sentry guarding the only exit. For a long moment, the only sound in the vast room was Chloe's ragged, wet breathing. Desmond stared down the length of the table at me, waiting for me to speak, waiting for me to offer pathetic excuses, or beg for their forgiveness. He was entirely accustomed to women bowing to his anger. He fully expected me to crumble under the weight of his furious silence. Instead of speaking, I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored charcoal blazer. I retrieved a small, sleek silver remote control. The metal felt cool, heavy, and solid against my palm. I looked directly into Desmond's eyes, holding his aggressive gaze with absolute unblinking intensity. I pressed the primary button on the device. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. A low, powerful electronic hum vibrated through the walls. The massive panels of floor-to-ceiling glass surrounding the boardroom suddenly transitioned. The crystal-clear, breathtaking view of the Los Angeles skyline vanished instantly, replaced by an impenetrable, solid white frost. The glass walls separating us from the outer office frosted over simultaneously. The bright natural sunlight was completely and utterly severed, leaving the room illuminated only by the stark, sterile glare of the overhead LED fixtures. A fraction of a second later, the heavy electronic deadbolts on the mahogany doors engaged. The loud, heavy metallic click echoed through the room like the firing pin of a heavy weapon. The acoustic profile of the space shifted immediately. The faint ambient noise of the building's ventilation and the distant hum of the city were entirely cut off. It no longer felt like a corporate meeting space. It felt exactly like a vault. It felt like a cage. The sudden aggressive lockdown completely shattered their arrogant composure. Chloe jumped in her seat, letting out a sharp squeal of genuine panic. She looked around at the opaque frosted walls, as if the room was actively shrinking around her. Preston shot up out of his chair, his eyes locked on the heavy wooden doors, his chest heaving with shallow, rapid breaths. He recognized a tactical trap, and he knew he was caught squarely in the center of it. Desmond gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning stark white. His face flushed a deeper, more dangerous shade of red. He was trying to process the sudden violent shift in the environment, his brain struggling to reconcile his perceived parental authority with the undeniable reality of his physical confinement. Rochelle was the first to speak. She absolutely refused to acknowledge the rising panic in the room, clinging desperately to her fabricated high society entitlement. She let out a harsh, mocking laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder in a display of forced bravado. "Stop playing games!" Zora Rochelle scoffed, her voice sharp and grating in the newly sealed, deadened acoustics of the room. She gestured dismissively at the frosted glass walls surrounding them. "You cannot afford to play God in a rented office. Turn the windows back to normal and unlock that door right now before I call building security to have you escorted out of your own workplace. You are acting like a petulant child throwing a tantrum." Desmond immediately seized on her fragile bravado, slamming his fist down on the walnut table. The heavy thud echoed sharply in the confined space. "Your mother is exactly right," Desmond roared, his voice booming with forced, desperate authority. "We are completely done humoring your theatrical stunts. You are going to log into your corporate terminal, you are going to pay that $40,000 right now, and you are going to issue a formal public apology to Preston's family. I will not allow you to ruin my impeccable reputation with your miserable, vindictive behavior. Do you understand me? You will process that wire transfer immediately so we can leave this miserable little cubicle." I let his demands hang in the cold, sterile air. I did not interrupt him. I let him yell. I let him expose the absolute depths of his delusion for everyone to see. He was a man drowning in a rising toxic tide of insurmountable debt, demanding that I throw him a life preserver made of solid gold. I looked past him at Preston, who was still standing rigidly near the locked door, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. Preston knew the truth. He knew there was no money left to steal. He knew his family was not owed an apology. He knew this was the absolute end of the line. I remained completely motionless until the pathetic echoes of Desmond's shouting faded into the frosted glass. I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I did not show a single ounce of emotion. The time for emotional reactions had died 15 years ago on their manicured front lawn. I reached down to the dark leather portfolio resting on the table beside me. My fingers closed around a thick, heavy document bound in premium dark red leather. The binding was pristine, the embossed gold lettering catching the harsh overhead light and gleaming sharply. I lifted the heavy document and placed it squarely on the center of the polished walnut table. With a sharp, deliberate flick of my wrist, I pushed it forward. The heavy leather binding slid across the smooth mahogany surface with a satisfying, continuous hiss. It traveled exactly 20 feet down the center of the table, slowing perfectly before coming to a complete, precise stop directly in front of Rochelle. She stared down at the gold lettering, her brow furrowing in deep, profound confusion. Desmond leaned over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read the dense legal text stamped across the cover. I placed my hands flat on the table, leaning forward just slightly. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and entirely suffocating. "I do not rent Rochelle," I said, my voice dropping into a register of glacial, terrifying calm. I enunciated every single syllable, ensuring the words penetrated the thick, stubborn layers of her profound ignorance. "I own this entire building." I paused, letting my eyes shift slowly from Rochelle's confused face to Desmond's suddenly rigid posture. I watched the realization begin to claw its way into their minds, and right now I continued the lethal certainty of my words, locking them into their seats. "You are trespassing." I watched the exact moment the truth finally breached Desmond's mental defenses. The aggressive, angry red flush completely and instantly drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly, ashen gray pallor. His jaw went entirely slack. His eyes widened, fixing on the red leather deed resting in front of his wife. The realization hit him with the devastating force of a physical blow. He was not demanding obedience from a subordinate failure of a daughter. He was a bankrupt, broken man sitting in a locked vault entirely at the mercy of a billionaire he had thrown away. I led the procession down the long, illuminated corridor. They followed me in a tight, defensive cluster, their earlier swagger rapidly deteriorating as the sheer scale of the penthouse began to register. We reached the heavy mahogany doors of the primary meeting space. Malik stepped forward, pushing the solid wood open with effortless grace, and stood aside to let the fraudulent quartet enter the room. The boardroom was explicitly designed to intimidate. It was a cavernous space dominated by a 30-foot table carved from a single slab of rare walnut. 20 high-backed, ergonomic black leather chairs lined the perimeter. The far wall was constructed entirely of transparent smart glass, offering an unobstructed, dizzying panoramic view of the Los Angeles skyline bathed in the bright afternoon sun. Desmond marched straight in and immediately dropped his heavy frame into the chair at the head of the table. It was a predictable, pathetic power play. He desperately needed to claim the physical seat of authority. Rochelle took the seat to his right, crossing her legs and lifting her chin in defiance. Chloe slumped down next to her mother, dropping her tear-stained face into her hands. Preston hovered near the doorway for a tense moment before reluctantly taking a seat at the extreme far end of the table, putting as much physical distance between himself and Desmond as possible. I did not take a seat. I remained standing at the opposite end of the mahogany table. Malik stepped inside and stood perfectly still by the entrance, a silent sentry guarding the only exit. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer and retrieved a sleek silver remote control. I held Desmond's aggressive gaze and pressed the primary button. The reaction was instantaneous. A low, powerful electronic hum vibrated through the walls. The massive panels of transparent glass immediately transitioned, shifting from crystal clear to an impenetrable, solid white frost. The natural sunlight was abruptly severed, leaving the room illuminated only by stark, sterile LED fixtures. A fraction of a second later, the heavy electronic deadbolts on the mahogany doors engaged with a loud, aggressive click that echoed like a firing pin. They were completely trapped. The sudden, absolute confinement shattered their remaining composure. Chloe shrieked, looking around frantically, as if the opaque walls were actively closing in on her. Preston shot up out of his chair, his eyes locked on the sealed doors, his chest heaving with rapid breaths. He recognized a tactical ambush, and he knew he was caught squarely in the center of it. Rochelle, clinging desperately to her fabricated high society entitlement, refused to acknowledge the rising panic. She let out a harsh, grating laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Stop playing games!" "Zora," Rochelle scoffed, her voice sounding thin and weak in the deadened acoustics of the sealed room. "You cannot afford to play God in a rented office. Turn those windows back to normal and unlock that door right now before I call building security to have you escorted out of your own workplace." I did not give them a single second to recover. Before Desmond could open his mouth to echo his wife's delusion, I reached down to the dark leather portfolio resting on the table beside me. I selected a thick, heavy document bound in premium red leather, the embossed gold lettering catching the harsh overhead light. I slid the heavy leather-bound deed across the mahogany table. It traveled with a menacing hiss, coming to a precise stop directly in front of Rochelle. "I do not rent Rochelle," I stated, my voice dropping into a register of glacial, terrifying calm. "I own this entire building, and right now you are trespassing." I watched the exact moment the truth finally breached Desmond's mental defenses. The aggressive, angry crimson flush instantly drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly ashen gray pallor. His jaw went slack. The realization hit him with the devastating force of a physical blow. He was not demanding obedience from a failure of a daughter. He was a bankrupt man sitting in a locked vault entirely at the mercy of a billionaire. I pulled out the Napa Vineyards financial portfolio and dropped it directly in front of Desmond. The heavy thud resonated through the room. "My firm acquires commercial debt, Dad," I said, leaning forward and resting my palms on the polished wood. "We specialize in buying out toxic liabilities. On Monday morning, while you were busy admiring floral arrangements you could not afford, I bought the vineyard's defaulted accounts. I bought all of them. I am not just the daughter you disowned. I am legally your debt collector." Desmond stared at the crest on the folder, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. His eyes tracked the columns of numbers, the aggressive red ink detailing late fees, property damages, and the absolute sum of his financial negligence. I picked up a single crisp sheet of paper. It was a formal notice of default. I slid the final notice across the table until it rested on top of his paralyzed hands. "You thought you were so clever, Desmond," I continued, enunciating every syllable. "You thought you could bypass the deposit requirements by leveraging your assets. You have exactly 24 hours to pay the $40,000 plus the compounding interest and penalty fees you have racked up over the past 72 hours. If you fail to wire that exact amount to my corporate account by this time tomorrow, I am legally seizing the collateral you put down for the wedding." I paused, letting the silence stretch into agony. "You're home." The words hung in the air, a lethal projectile that completely decimated their reality. Rochelle let out a sharp, choked gasp, her heavily ringed fingers flying up to cover her mouth. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, her trembling shoulders betraying the absolute depth of her horror. "You cannot do that," Rochelle whispered, her country club poise completely disintegrated. "You cannot take our house, Zora. Where would we go? What would people say?" "I suggest you look into budget motels," I replied, my tone entirely devoid of empathy. "The social circles you desperately cling to do not tolerate homelessness. Tomorrow, everyone in your precious neighborhood will watch my foreclosure team change the locks. Your reputation is already dead." Desmond finally erupted. He slammed his fists onto the table and vaulted out of his chair. "This is illegal," he roared, spit flying from his lips. "I will hire the best defense attorneys in the state. I will tie you up in litigation for 10 years. Malik took a single silent step forward. His physical presence was a lethal immediate warning. Desmond froze instantly. "You cannot afford an attorney," Desmond I stated smoothly. "We audited your accounts. Your business accounts are overdrawn. Your personal savings are liquidated. If you attempt to retain legal counsel, they will run a background check and drop you immediately. No one works for free for a man who steals from his own company." Chloe bolted upright, her ruined wedding dress rustling loudly. The reality had finally pierced her self-centered delusion. "Dad, what is she talking about?" Chloe shrieked. "Did you put our house up for my wedding? Are we going to be homeless? Tell me she is lying." Desmond could not look his favorite daughter in the eye. The great patriarch stood exposed as an absolute fraud. His silence was the only confirmation Chloe needed. She whipped her head toward me, her face contorted with hate. "You are a monster, Zora. You planned this to ruin my life because you are a sad, vindictive loser." I checked the gold Rolex on my wrist. "The clock is ticking, Chloe. Insulting me does not pause the compounding interest." The imminent threat of losing her sprawling suburban palace finally broke Rochelle's fragile sanity. She spun around in her chair, her eyes locking onto Preston, who was still cowering at the far end of the boardroom table, desperately trying to blend into the shadows. "Preston!" Rochelle screamed, turning to Preston. She reverted to her only strategy, demanding salvation from a wealthy man. "Preston, call your father. Tell his trust manager to wire the funds. Pay the $40,000 right now so we can leave this miserable place." Preston recoiled as if struck. He shrank back into the heavy leather chair, gripping the armrests in sheer panic. He opened his mouth, but only a pathetic squeak emerged. He looked at Rochelle, then at Chloe, and finally his terrified eyes locked directly onto mine. He knew that I knew the truth about his non-existent wealth. I looked at the boy whose entire identity was built on a trust fund that did not exist. The absolute absurdity of Rochelle demanding salvation from a con artist drowning in his own debt was simply too much to contain. I started laughing. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a deep, genuine, echoing laugh that filled the soundproof boardroom. It was the sound of 15 years of trauma finally breaking apart into dust. My laughter bounced off the frosted glass walls, sharp and unyielding, amplifying in the acoustically sealed space. It was not a polite, restrained corporate chuckle. It was a deep, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated triumph that I had held inside my chest for 15 years. I let it echo through the boardroom, watching as the sheer force of my amusement physically battered the four of them. They had spent my entire life telling me I was fundamentally broken, and yet here they were performing a perfectly choreographed comedy of errors for my entertainment. Rochelle recoiled as if she had been physically struck. Her jaw dropped and she clutched the pearl necklace at her throat, her knuckles turning white. She looked at me as though I had suddenly sprouted a second head. She could not comprehend the reality of the situation. Her brain was entirely short-circuiting, desperately trying to map her outdated view of me as a helpless victim onto the ruthless predator currently holding the deed to her life. "What is wrong with you?" Rochelle shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain of her rising panic. "Are you having a psychotic break? I am telling Preston to fix this. I am telling him to call his wealth manager. There is absolutely nothing funny about this situation, Zora." I slowly stopped laughing. I let the silence rush back into the room, thick and suffocating, before I leveled my gaze at my mother. "You are demanding a rescue from a mirage." "Rochelle," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any warmth. "You are screaming at an empty suit." I turned my attention away from her confused, panicked face and looked down at the documents spread across my side of the walnut table. I bypassed Desmond's bankruptcy filings and reached for the thick red leather-bound dossier that Malik had brought into my office earlier. The hostile acquisition file. I picked up the heavy dossier and held it for a brief second, feeling the weight of the absolute destruction contained within its pages. Then, with a smooth, practiced motion, I slid it straight down the center of the polished wood. The heavy leather glided effortlessly across the long table, the friction creating a low, satisfying hiss. It sailed past Desmond, who was still staring blankly at his own foreclosure notice, and came to a precise halt directly in front of Chloe's folded, trembling arms. Chloe stared down at the bright red cover. She did not touch it. She looked at it as if it were a live explosive device. Her smeared mascara made her eyes look massive and terrified against her pale skin. "Open it, Chloe," I commanded. The instruction was not a request. It was an absolute directive. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly, but her hands remained paralyzed in her lap. She cast a desperate, pleading look toward Preston, seeking reassurance, seeking the confident, wealthy patriarch she thought she had married. But Preston was not looking at her. Preston was staring at the red folder with a look of profound, sickening dread. The fine sheen of sweat on his forehead had coalesced into thick drops rolling down his temples. "Since your husband seems to have lost his ability to speak, I will summarize the executive findings for you," I said, leaning back into my chair and folding my hands together. "There is no trust fund, Chloe." The words dropped into the room like lead weights. Chloe blinked, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She looked from me to Preston and back again. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Preston is a Vanderbilt heir. His family owns maritime shipping companies in Connecticut. He has a portfolio. He showed me the statements." "He showed you digitally altered PDF documents printed on high-quality cardstock," I corrected her smoothly, feeling a cold surgical satisfaction as I dismantled the illusion piece by piece. "Meet your blue blood prince, Chloe. Preston does not come from a lineage of shipping magnates. He comes from a long line of middle-class obscurity. He legally changed his last name 3 years ago to sound more aristocratic." I gestured casually toward the unopened red dossier. "It is all fully documented in Section 2 of that file. My firm ran a comprehensive deep-dive background check on him the moment Desmond tried to use him as a character reference for a corporate loan extension last month." Preston let out a low, strangled sound, half gasp and half groan, and sank lower into his high-backed leather chair. He looked as though he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. "Your perfect old money groom currently holds exactly $250,000 in hidden high-interest personal debt." I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly in the frosted glass prison. "He owes money to predatory lenders. He owes money to private syndicates. That beautiful imported German sports car he drives is leased under a Shell LLC that is currently 3 months behind on payments. The vintage luxury watch he flashes at your country club dinners is a high-tier replica he bought in a back alley in Macau." Chloe let out a sharp, genuine cry of horror. She finally reached out and flipped the heavy red cover open. She stared at the top page, a comprehensive financial summary detailing Preston's catastrophic liabilities. Her eyes darted rapidly back and forth across the aggressive red ink, the numbers completely destroying the fairy tale narrative she had built her entire identity around. "But it gets significantly worse," I said, ensuring I held the absolute attention of everyone in the room. "He is not just broke, Chloe. He is actively facing severe legal consequences." "Turn to page 4. Chloe mechanically turned the thick pages, her hands shaking violently. "He is currently facing 2 separate civil suits for wire fraud and misrepresentation," I announced to the silent room. "He convinced a group of amateur investors to back a vaporware technology startup that never existed, and he funneled their seed capital directly into his own lifestyle to maintain the illusion of wealth. He is a professional parasite. He bounces from one affluent social circle to the next, projecting an aura of immense success until he can secure a host." Rochelle let out a sudden, high-pitched shriek. She lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table. "You are lying!" she screamed, spittle flying from her lips. "You fabricated these documents because you are jealous. Preston is a wealthy man. He paid for the rehearsal dinner at the country club. He showed us his black card. He paid for that dinner using a line of credit he fraudulently opened using Desmond's company as a corporate guarantor." I shot back, snapping my gaze to Rochelle and silencing her instantly. "Malik intercepted the authorization request 3 weeks ago. He is a grifter, Rochelle. He is a con artist who identified a family desperate to look rich, and he latched on." I looked back at Chloe, who was now weeping openly, tears splashing down onto the financial ruin detailed in the dossier. "He did not marry you for love, Chloe," I said, my tone devoid of any pity. He married you because he thought he was marrying into a massive stable fortune. He married you because Desmond promised him a highly visible six-figure executive role within the family company. He was banking on a massive corporate signing bonus to pay off his predatory lenders before they broke his kneecaps. He thought he had secured a lifetime ticket to the upper class. I watched Preston physically flinch at the accuracy of my assessment. The arrogant swagger he had carried into my building was entirely gone. He was nothing but a terrified, cornered animal facing the absolute destruction of his carefully crafted survival strategy. I stood up, slowly pushing my chair back. The faint sound of the wheels rolling across the carpet was the only noise in the boardroom. I buttoned my blazer, smoothing the dark fabric as I walked deliberately around the edge of the massive table. I moved with slow, predatory grace, stepping past my frozen, horrified parents and my weeping sister. I stopped when I reached the far end of the table, standing directly over Preston. He shrank back in his chair, refusing to look up at my face. His hands were gripping his knees so tightly, his knuckles were stark white. "But here is the true, breathtaking tragedy of your little arrangement, Preston," I said softly, my voice carrying clearly down the length of the table to where Desmond was sitting in absolute paralyzed silence. I leaned down, placing my hands on the arms of Preston's chair, trapping him in place. I forced him to look at me. His eyes were wide, panicked, and darting frantically around the room. "Meet Desmond," I said, turning my head slightly to gesture toward my father. Preston's terrified gaze slowly shifted down the table to look at the man he thought was his billionaire savior. "You spent 6 grueling months courting a woman you genuinely believed was a pampered heiress," I explained to Preston, laying out the brutal reality with surgical precision. "You endured their insufferable dinners. You played the part of the wealthy aristocrat. You thought Desmond was a titan of industry. You thought you were marrying into a financial fortress that would protect you from your creditors." I stood up straight, projecting my voice so every single syllable struck Desmond like a physical blow. "But Desmond is as fake as your replica watch," I announced. "A month ago to pay for the lavish, ridiculous wedding you just ruined." Desmond took out a third highly leveraged mortgage on their suburban estate. His corporate accounts are completely drained. He has been siphoning escrow funds to pay his country club dues. His company is functionally insolvent, and as of Monday morning, I personally own every single ounce of their defaulted debt. Preston's mouth fell open. He stared at Desmond, a look of profound, sickening horror washing over his face. He looked at the red-faced, sweating older man and finally saw the truth. He saw the exact same desperation he carried in his own chest. "There is no corner office waiting for you, Preston," I said, delivering the final crushing blow. "There is no six-figure executive role. There is no signing bonus. There is absolutely no money." I looked from Preston's devastated face to Desmond's pale, defeated expression, and finally to Chloe, who was looking at her new husband with pure, unadulterated revulsion. "You two conned each other," I stated, the absolute irony of their mutual destruction hanging heavy in the cold air. "You both faked a kingdom to catch a thief, and you both succeeded perfectly." My laughter faded into the cold, acoustically deadened air of the boardroom. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the suffocating vacuum right before a high-yield detonation. I watched the realization fully infect their minds. The absolute, unvarnished truth had finally cornered them, and with nowhere left to run, the only option remaining was to turn their venom upon each other. They were rats trapped in a sinking barrel, and the water was rapidly rising. Preston was the first to break. The polished blue blood facade he had meticulously curated melted away instantly, revealing the desperate, cornered street hustler underneath. He lunged away from the far end of the table, his heavy leather chair toppling backward with a loud, violent crash that echoed sharply in the sealed room. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my father's face, his eyes wide with a feral, unhinged panic. "You lied to me," Preston screamed, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its aristocratic affectation. "You sat in the dining room of that ridiculous country club, looked me dead in the eye, and told me your company was aggressively expanding. You promised me a $200,000 signing bonus the day after I married your daughter. You showed me fake quarterly projections. You showed me a fabricated asset portfolio. Desmond tried to stand up and match Preston's aggressive posture, but his legs seemed to lack their structural integrity. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles bone white, his face a terrifying mottled shade of purple. "You parasitic little fraud," Desmond roared back, though his voice lacked its usual booming, tyrannical authority. It sounded ragged, desperate, and hollow. "You told me your trust fund matured next month? You sat in my house and swore you were bringing 7 figures of liquid capital into this family. I mortgaged my entire life to pay for that circus of a wedding. I leveraged the roof over my head to secure your investment." "There is no investment!" Preston yelled, slamming both of his hands flat onto the glass surface of the table. "I owe dangerous people a lot of money, Desmond. Very dangerous people who do not care about excuses. I married your spoiled, useless daughter because you were my exit strategy. You were my financial shield. And now you are sitting here telling me you are completely broke. You are bankrupt." The phrase spoiled, useless daughter seemed to finally pierce through the thick fog of Chloe's shock. She slowly raised her head from her hands. The heavy, muddy silk of her ruined bridal gown rustled loudly in the confined space as she sat up straight. She looked at Preston, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. The tear-streaked victim routine vanished entirely. "What did you just call me?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling with rising fury. Then her eyes darted down to her left hand. The massive 4-carat emerald-cut diamond she had been flashing at every single person she met for the past year felt suddenly heavy, cold, and utterly worthless. She ripped her hand up, shoving the ring directly toward Preston's face. "Is this fake?" Chloe shrieked, her voice reaching a piercing pitch that made the thick, smart glass walls vibrate. "Tell me the truth right now, Preston. Is this ring fake?" Preston did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive cut. "Of course it is fake, Chloe. It is premium cubic zirconia. I bought it online for $350. Did you honestly think I was going to drop 50 grand on a ring for a girl whose entire personality revolves around Instagram filters and daddy's credit card?" Chloe let out an animalistic scream. She launched herself across the short distance separating them, her perfectly manicured nails curved into lethal claws. She slammed into Preston's chest, her fists pounding wildly against his rented tuxedo jacket. "You ruined my life," she wailed, her blows landing with loud, frantic thuds. "You embarrassed me. My friends are going to know. Everyone at the club is going to know I married a broke loser. You lied to me. I hate you. I hate you." Preston easily grabbed both of her wrists, halting her assault. He shoved her backward with enough force that she stumbled, her heavy dress tangling around her legs, and she collapsed heavily into an empty leather chair. "Grow up, Chloe. You love the idea of the money, not me. We are both totally broke, so stop acting like you are the only victim here. You were perfectly happy to spend money you did not have." Desmond watched his favored daughter get shoved into a chair, but he made absolutely no move to defend her. He could not. The reality of his catastrophic financial failure had finally breached the core of his being, overriding any parental instinct he might have possessed. He let out a strange, wheezing gasp, his right hand flying up to clutch tightly at the center of his chest. His knees buckled completely, and he sank down heavily into the head chair. He looked small suddenly, deflated and gray. The overbearing, tyrannical patriarch who had terrified me for 18 years was gone, replaced by a pathetic, aging man, hyperventilating under the harsh LED lights. "My company!" Desmond gasped, his eyes unfocused, staring blankly at the red leather dossier sitting on the table. 30 years. I built it for 30 years. It is gone. The house is gone. The reputation is gone. Everything is gone. He was not talking to Preston. He was not talking to Rochelle. He was talking to the void completely consumed by the sudden, absolute evaporation of his legacy. He was having a panic attack, his chest heaving as he realized there was no one left to blame but himself. Rochelle watched her husband collapse into a trembling, wheezing heap, and then she looked at her daughter sobbing hysterically in a ruined dress over a fake diamond reality. The walls of her meticulously curated, socially flawless life were crashing down around her, burying her under a mountain of insurmountable debt and public humiliation. She realized in that exact second that she could never show her face at the country club again. Her friends would devour her. The gossip would be ruthless, immediate, and permanent. The charity galas, the tennis matches, the luncheons, all of it was over. She slowly turned her gaze away from the wreckage of her family and locked her eyes on me. I stood perfectly still at the far end of the table, flanked by the silent, imposing presence of Malik, watching them tear each other to shreds. I saw the exact moment Rochelle's pride finally shattered. It did not break with dignity. It shattered with the pathetic, desperate cravenness of a woman who valued survival and comfort over self-respect. She looked at the bespoke suit I wore, the massive boardroom, the undeniable wealth surrounding her, and her survival instinct overrode years of maternal disdain. She slipped out of her high-backed chair. Her knees hit the imported Italian marble floor with a sharp, painful crack. She did not bother to stand back up. She began to crawl. Her expensive designer skirt bunched around her thighs as she scrambled across the floor, bypassing the heavy mahogany table entirely. She moved with frantic, terrifying speed, her hands slapping against the cold, polished stone. Malik tensed immediately, shifting his weight forward slightly, ready to intercept the threat, but I raised a single finger, signaling him to hold his position. I wanted to see exactly how low she would sink. I needed to witness the absolute destruction of her arrogance. Rochelle reached my feet. She threw her arms forward, her manicured fingers closing desperately around the crisp, tailored hem of my charcoal trousers. She looked up at me, her face a horrific mess of smeared mascara, streaming tears, and pure, unfiltered desperation. "Zora, please," Rochelle wailed, her voice cracking, the sound bouncing pathetically off the frosted glass. "Please, you have to help us. You have millions. You own this entire building. $40,000 is nothing to you. It is pocket change. You can pay the vineyard. You can pay off the mortgage. You can save our house." She tightened her grip on my clothing, pulling herself up slightly, completely abandoning any shred of dignity she had carried into my office. "You can save us, Zora!" she sobbed, looking up at me with pleading, terrified eyes. "You are my daughter." Rochelle's hands clawed at the charcoal wool of my trousers. The sheer desperation swimming in her eyes was something I once would have given absolutely anything to see directed at me with love. Now it just looked pathetic. I looked down at the woman who had brought me into this world, the woman who had watched me get thrown out into the cold dark with nothing but a trash bag, and I searched my chest for a single spark of empathy. There was nothing. The space where my childhood longing used to reside was entirely hollow, filled, instead with the cold, hard certainty of a self-made titan. I took a deliberate step backward. The motion was smooth, requiring no real force, but the sharp tug yanked the fine fabric of my suit straight out of her white-knuckled grip. Rochelle's hands fell empty to the Italian marble, slapping against the cold stone. She looked up, her mouth falling open in a silent wail of pure disbelief. "You built a family entirely on appearances, Rochelle," I said, my voice ringing with absolute clinical finality. "You cultivated a beautiful hollow garden, and you actively poisoned the roots to keep it looking perfect. Now the season has changed. You can live in the reality of the harvest you planted. You are not my problem." I turned my back on her kneeling form and surveyed the wreckage scattered across my mahogany table. The boardroom had devolved into an active war zone of shattered egos. Preston had realized his golden ticket was nothing but a devastating mirage. He had leaped out of his chair, his face contorted in a feral panic, and was screaming at Desmond, wildly accusing him of fabricating his corporate assets and destroying his life. Chloe, completely unhinged by the revelation of her husband's grift, launched herself at Preston. She shrieked hysterically, her heavy wine-stained gown tangling around her legs as she battered his chest with her fists, demanding to know if the massive stone sitting on her left ring finger was a fake. Preston did not even try to defend himself. He simply laughed in her face, confirming the diamond was a cheap piece of glass he bought online. Desmond did not intervene to save his favorite daughter. He could not move. The absolute reality of his catastrophic financial failure had finally breached his stubborn delusion. He clutched his chest, his breathing ragged and shallow, sinking lower into his high-backed leather chair as his total ruin was laid bare for his wife to witness. He was a broken, defeated husk of a tyrant staring blankly at the red ledger detailing his demise. They were all broken, entirely broke and completely exposed. I lifted my chin and looked toward the corner of the room. Malik, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the thick, toxic hysteria. Send security. Escort these strangers out of my building. Malik did not smile, but a glint of dark, profound satisfaction flashed in his eyes. He raised his wrist to his mouth, speaking a sharp, coded command into his cuff microphone. The response was instantaneous. The heavy electronic deadbolts disengaged with a loud metallic clack. The mahogany doors swung open, revealing a team of 6 broad-shouldered security personnel dressed in immaculate black suits. The extraction was swift, professional, and utterly devoid of dignity. 2 guards flanked Desmond, hauling him to his feet. He offered no resistance, shuffling toward the corridor, like a man walking to his own execution. Preston tried to bolt for the door, desperately attempting to slip past the team, but Malik stepped effortlessly into his path. Malik dropped a heavy, immovable hand onto Preston's shoulder, spinning the grifter around and shoving him directly into the waiting grip of 2 security officers. Chloe and Rochelle required significantly more physical effort. Chloe kicked and thrashed, screaming incoherent threats and vicious insults as the guards lifted her by her arms, dragging her ruined silk dress across the pristine carpet. Rochelle simply refused to stand. She stayed on her knees, sobbing hysterically and reaching back toward me until the guards firmly hauled her up and propelled her out the door. The heavy mahogany doors slid shut, the magnetic locks re-engaged. I pressed the silver remote, and the smart glass transitioned back from a solid opaque white to crystal clear transparency. The sudden flood of golden Los Angeles sunlight washed over the long walnut table. The frantic screaming noise of my former family was instantly severed, replaced by the deep, soothing ambient hum of the climate control system. The silence that filled the room afterward was deafening, heavy, and profound. It was the most beautiful, perfect sound I had ever heard. Exactly 30 days passed. The financial sector moves with ruthless, mechanical efficiency, and the wheels of karma, once set into motion, grind forward without mercy. The fallout from the boardroom was immediate, absolute, and publicly devastating. Preston never even made it back to the suburban estate. The moment my security team deposited him on the sidewalk outside my high-rise, he vanished into the smog of the city. He abandoned his leased sports car, blocked all incoming phone numbers, and skipped town entirely to avoid the aggressive private debt collectors closing in on his location. Chloe, left utterly destitute and publicly humiliated, filed for a rapid annulment. She attempted to pawn her massive engagement ring to pay for the legal filing fees, only to suffer the final crushing indignity of a jeweler tossing the worthless cubic zirconia back across the counter. Desmond and Rochelle fared no better. The 24-hour deadline I issued had expired exactly to the second. True to my word, my acquisitions firm initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings on their heavily leveraged estate. Desmond, terrified of the public spectacle of sheriff's deputies dragging his belongings onto the manicured lawn in front of his neighbors, panicked. He fire-sold the sprawling suburban mansion to an aggressive cash buyer at a massive, catastrophic 50% loss. The meager equity left over from the sale barely covered a fraction of his outstanding commercial liabilities. They were forced to downsize drastically, moving their few remaining possessions into a cramped, outdated 2-bedroom apartment situated in a noisy, undesirable zip code directly adjacent to a major commercial freeway. The thin drywall and the constant vibrating roar of heavy traffic became the new, inescapable soundtrack to Rochelle's life. Their social exile was total and permanent. Desmond's corporate bankruptcy filing became a matter of public record, splashed across the front pages of the local business journals. The country club immediately revoked their membership for severe non-payment of dues. The affluent friends Rochelle had spent decades desperately curating stopped answering her calls overnight. The charity gala invitations ceased. The luxury luncheon dates evaporated. They were entirely abandoned by the social circle they had sacrificed their own daughter to impress. left to rot in the harsh, unforgiving reality they had built for themselves. I stood on the sprawling wraparound balcony of my penthouse, feeling the cool, crisp evening air drift off the Pacific Ocean. The Los Angeles skyline stretched out endlessly below me, an ocean of glittering diamonds and pulsing rubies, navigating the gridlocked arteries of the city. The sheer, breathtaking scale of the metropolis always served as a perfect reminder of how vastly the world expanded beyond the narrow, toxic confines of my childhood. Behind me, the heavy sliding glass doors were pushed wide open, letting the sounds of genuine celebration spill out onto the terrace. Inside my home, there was no forced pretense. There were no hushed, passive-aggressive insults or desperate attempts to maintain a fabricated image. There was only the loud, booming laughter of my executive team, the sharp clinking of heavy crystal glasses, and the warm, unfiltered joy of people who had earned their immense success through relentless hard work. They were the brilliant, loyal individuals who stood by me when I was building this empire from the ground up in the dark. They were my true friends. They were my chosen family. The soft, deliberate scuff of a leather shoe against the stone tiles alerted me. Malik stepped out onto the balcony, his massive frame silhouetted against the bright interior lights. His usual stoic, guarded expression was softened by a rare, genuine smile. He extended his hand, offering me a crystal, stemless glass filled with a deep, rich vintage Pinot Noir. I accepted the glass, feeling the cool crystal against my skin. We did not need to exchange words. The deep mutual respect forged through years of ruthless strategic battles and hard-won victories spoke for itself. He raised his own glass in a silent, respectful salute. We toasted to a record-breaking financial quarter, to a hostile acquisition executed with absolute flawless precision, and to the permanent elimination of toxic liabilities. Malik nodded once, stepping back inside to rejoin the vibrant celebration, leaving me alone with the glittering skyline. I raised the glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark wine. The complex, robust flavors settled warmly in my chest. I leaned against the thick glass railing, breathing in the cool night air, listening to the genuine laughter of my chosen family echoing safely behind me. I looked down at the sprawling city, a self-made titan reigning over an empire of my own design, and I smiled. The revenge was not just sweet, it was absolute justice. The most profound takeaway from this story is that your true worth is never defined by people blinded by their own toxicity. Blood ties do not automatically guarantee loyalty, and a real family is built on mutual respect rather than manipulation. When you finally stop chasing the approval of those who continually tear you down, you create the space to build an empire on your own terms. True justice isn't merely watching a fake facade crumble, it is walking away with your dignity and surrounding yourself with a chosen family who genuinely celebrates your authentic success. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your empowering journey in the comments below.